G'day, I'm Shane Dowling from the website Kangaroo Court of Australia, and in a minute I'll play an interview I recorded on Friday the 25th of October 2019 with Rob McBride, who owns the New South Wales property Tolarno Station. Now this is a story about government mismanagement, corruption in relation to water in country areas that are already suffering from drought. The problem is no accident. It's deliberate for the financial greed of big business and a few wealthy people. But I'll let Rob McBride explain the problem, and then at the end there's a video of Rob's daughter Kate discussing the issue, and also a short video of New South Wales State MP Helen Dalton, who's a member for Murray from the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party, and farmer irrigator Chris Brooks talking about water licence corruption, how politicians don't have to declare their water licences. With a lot of corruption you never get to see what damage it has done, but with this issue you can see for yourself dead fish, barren land and dying towns. Rob McBride says Australia will be importing milk from China in 5 years because of water mismanagement, corruption, and he puts a powerful argument forward to support that viewpoint. So let's have a listen to what he has to say.
G'day ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Darling River. Just picked this off the bank, another dead cod. Look, when the government talks about drought, it really breaks our heart, because this isn't about drought, this is about corruption and destruction of a river system. Species not only like cod, catfish, all the other 50 odd species of fish, but also the shrimp, turtles, mussels, all these species are being murdered. Now ladies and gentlemen, we can't change it in the short term, but we can find those accountable for this and make them accountable in front of a Royal Commission and later in front of a court system. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to live through this, and to watch your ecosystem collapse is criminal, and the people who did this must pay through the court system. Ladies and gentlemen, the fish are dying, your heartland's dying, and please tell others. This one here, maybe 50 years old, maybe older than me, and he died for no purpose except greed and corruption. He didn't die because of drought or the hardship of Australia. He's been here millions of years. He's effectively a dinosaur and he survived, but we potentially have killed him off. Thank you for your time, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
So I'm here talking with Rob McBride. Rob, can you tell us a bit about your station and how long you've owned it and what you run, what sort of animals you run on your station?
No, very good indeed. Thank you, Shane. Yeah, Tolarno Station is about 45k south of Menindee Lakes on the Darling River system. It runs about 500,000 acres. Our family's been there about 80 years. Having said that, we've been farming in Australia for about 167 years. About the same length of time that Tolarno's been there, because Tolarno got going in 1851. We run a combination of wild bush goats and effectively merinos. And again, somewhere in the vicinity of 8,000 merinos over the 500,000 acres. Obviously, pretty dry times, so we've spread our stock out as best as we can to keep them alive and do well as far as that's concerned.
Now, one of the issues the issue that you have is that everyone knows we're in drought, or Queensland and New South Wales are in drought, but it's not the drought is your key issue, it's the fact that it's the water management.
Totally, Shane. Look, the Menindee Lakes are 4 times the size of Sydney Harbour. Now, they're effectively the very heart of the Murray-Darling Basin. 80% of the golden perch and also the cod come from the Menindee Lakes. So to give your listeners some idea, 4 times the size of Sydney Harbour. You've got tens of millions of fish that have survived there for the best part of 30 million years. Now, there's 121 species of bird life come from around the world in the hundreds of thousands. So we're looking probably at least 200 to 250,000 birds migrate there and stay there for prolonged periods, the furthest of which come from Siberia in Russia. Now, effectively, that's been the heart of the Murray-Darling Basin since time immemorial. That's why it's the major breeding ground. Before white man got here, the lakes had creeks running into and out of the Darling River system. So during high water periods, the lakes would fill up and they'd slowly go down, and effectively making sure that the Darling River always had a good supply of water. Then in 1946, the South Australian government worked out how important these lakes were, and they did some slight modifications. So Thomas Playford understood how important these lakes were and just made slight modifications so you could guarantee that you'd get between 8 and 10 years supply of water every time the lakes filled up. Now the lakes are somewhere in the vicinity of 7 to 9 metres in depth, and as I said, 4 times the size of Sydney Harbour. I mean, they're a vast amount of water, and it just shows you how important they are to the whole ecosystem of the Murray-Darling Basin. Now, twice in 4 years, they were filled up and drained. Now, never before in white history have they been intentionally undermined. Now, the integrity of the lakes have been destroyed and undermined by the actions of the Murray-Darling Basin Authority and the New South Wales and federal governments, all of which have deliberately released the water far too quickly for no apparent purpose. And in fact, I'd spent time, the first time the lakes were drained far too quickly, Neil Andrews was the chairman of the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. I sat with him in Adelaide and went over at length what he did, why he drained it far too quickly, and why that could never happen again. By 2017, the lakes had miraculously filled again during the winter period, which they never normally do. It was just by chance that we had rains up the catchment in the right places. So they were drained. So we had them filled again, which was an absolute miracle. Now, the problem was they were drained very, very quickly in the period 2016-17, and I can give you the months, but effectively over a 4-month period, the Murray-Darling Basin Authority let over 7 years' supply of water out.
How do they do that?
Effectively just open the gates. So we had very much a full river going down into down the Darling River system, and from where Menindee is to the Murray is somewhere in the vicinity of 550 to 600 kilometres of river miles. You had 2/3 of a river. Now, that was while the Murray was already in flood. So the Murray, South Australia could not call upon the water. So the way the laws work in Australia, the Murray-Darling Basin Authority was set up to police the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. So the Murray-Darling Basin Plan was set up 5 years ago so that there'd be integrity between the states and that the river system of Australia would be protected. And that's exactly the opposite to what the Murray-Darling Basin Authority has done. They've allowed, under their timescales, they've allowed the total mismanagement of the Darling River system, draining the Menindee Lakes twice in 4 years. That has never been done before, and that was strategic, deliberate, and it undermined the Menindee Lakes, but it's also by destroying our family's business and all those along the Darling River system. You've effectively destroyed the Barkinji. Now, the Barkinji Nation have been there for the best part of 60,000 years, and effectively the Barker was what the Darling was called before it became the Darling River, before white man got here. So the Barkinji Nation has been totally decimated.
That's the Aboriginal nation, is it?
Aboriginal nation,
yep.
Based in Wilcannia nowadays, but a large number also based in Menindee. And you've got the Mungo Man, the oldest skeletal remains of a deliberately buried individual on the planet. He is 100 kilometres from Tolarno Station and probably 150 kilometres from Menindee Lakes. So in the history of the planet, the oldest skeletal remains of an individual deliberately buried in some sort of type of ceremony. So it just shows the importance of the Menindee Lakes and the importance of the Darling River system. The Darling River, throughout its history, has run about 40% of the water supply of the Murray-Darling came down the Darling. So what we've got is a situation where the Darling River system has been deliberately undermined by the Murray-Darling Basin Authority at every turn, and the New South Wales government. So we've got a situation where the governments have deliberately known that the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, instead of acting for the interest of the river, it appears to be acting for the benefits of what the Liberal Party wanted. The Liberal Party seems to want big corporates to take over the river system, and that's effectively what the laws have changed in New South Wales, especially in 2012-13, where where there was a sliding scale of water entitlements based on how much water was coming down the river, Katrina Hodgkinson, as Water Minister of New South Wales in 2012-13, deliberately turned that upside down. So instead of a sliding scale based on how much water came down the river system, all of a sudden, water licences that were very worthless to a large degree were at the bottom, which were the cotton industry licences for floodplain harvesting. They raced to the top of the entitlements, and they were granted 3 years' supply of water in advance. So you had a situation where...
That was referred to ICAC, wasn't it, for them to investigate her over that?
Agreed. So ICAC is supposed to be investigating. ICAC came to our region 18 months ago, and we're still awaiting the findings of ICAC, because ICAC investigated a number of water ministers of New South Wales. So it ranges from Katrina Hodgkinson was allegedly investigated, also Kevin Humphreys, who was the sitting member for our region, and the only proven water thief who's been prosecuted, that family had said that they pumped during an embargo because Kevin Humphreys, who's our sitting member and water minister at the time, gave them approval to pump during an embargo. Now, that in itself is the basis. If their allegations are correct, certainly legal proceedings should be up against the New South Wales Water Minister at the time, Kevin Humphreys, who's in recent times stood down and tried to run away from the responsibilities. And obviously more recently, other water ministers in New South Wales have done a number of different policies to undermine the integrity of not only the Darling River system, but also the Menindee Lakes. And as recently as 3 years ago, the New South Wales government raced through a $650 million program to run a pipeline. Instead of, there was a pipeline from Menindee for the last 60 years, from Menindee to Broken Hill, to supply Broken Hill with water, and it's done so without fail for 60 years. Now, that pipeline has been superseded for a $650 million loan from the Chinese government. So we've taken loans from the Chinese government to put a $650 million pipeline cross-country, not following the river, but cross-country, taking water out of the Murray River system to run cross-country to Broken Hill. Now, given there's only 10,000 families in Broken Hill, a $600 million project, you've got to ask why that was undertaken. And certainly, why was the water taken out of the Murray River system instead of the Darling? And why wasn't that system utilising the Menindee Lakes? Clearly, the policies of the New South Wales government and the Northern Masters, because that's what we call the people in the Northern Basin who have been able to totally control the government policies in New South Wales and federally.
And that to a large part is Queensland as well, isn't it? Southern Queensland.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, absolutely, is Queensland as well.
Can I just bring you up for a second? I just want to say something. I'll put some pictures up on the video, but just the average person doesn't know where you are geographically. Basically, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Darling runs from southern Queensland, roughly in the middle, from east to west. Runs along New South Wales, largely to the west, obviously. That's where Broken Hill is. That's where the Menindee Lakes are. And then it runs through New South Wales, and it meets up with the Murray down in Victoria. So so the average person
in Wentworth. So it's at Wentworth where the Murray and the Darling meet, which is in New South Wales, but effectively, so it is still in New South Wales effectively, but it's very close to Mildura. But yeah, it is in New South Wales at Wentworth that it. So it travels a 1,500 kilometre journey. It's actually the longest river system in Australia.
Now the Darling starts. It also roughly starts at St George, where the Federal Water Minister David Littleproud. That's his electorate.
There's 3 electorates that are very, very interesting in that area. So you've got David Littleproud's, you've got Barnaby Joyce's, and you've got Angus Taylor's. Now, what's intriguing is under the Water Acts in Australia is in parliamentary situation, if you go into Parliament, you must disclose your entitlements of, say, BHP shares and things along those lines. That does not apply to water licences. So we could have a situation when John Howard in 2007 took water off the rivers and gave it to the bankers of Macquarie Street. it wasn't done for the goodness of the nation. It was done to profiteer out of water, because was it 2% of water on the planet's fresh? Of that, 1% is achievably you're able to get. So it is more invaluable than gold, and especially in the driest inhabited continent on the planet, effectively water is everything. And all the people have done, with the help of destroying the integrity of the river system by successive governments, both state and national, Liberal National Party governments, they've done policies to intentionally destroy the integrity of the river for short-term big corporates. There's no question about that. From everything from floodplain harvesting, which is a means by which you laser level all the catchment areas of the Darling, laser level it, take off all the trees. There's 7.1 million hectares of land that's been laser leveled, destroyed, and then you put a big bank up on the river. So where the water used to hit the ground and run into the creeks, into the rivers, that's all been laser leveled, and there's now barriers to stop the water going in. Now, the New South Wales government and the federal government allow that under the pretext and concept of floodplain harvesting. There's no harvesting, they're just destroying the whole catchment of the Darling River system.
They're basically building their own private dams in a massive way.
There is a huge network of massive dams, and what's intriguing is there was policies in place from the mid-1992-93 period where the states had agreed to take no longer extract water. The current licence systems that were in place should remain, and no greater licences. That has been totally undermined by Queensland and New South Wales, with a massive explosion of private dams along the river system. Now, even in recent times, these have continued to expand and explode under the control of the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. Now, since the 1970s, we have had satellite imagery of all the river systems of Australia. So we can go back until mid-1972 to work out that private dams have exploded on this river system. They are outside the laws of Australia. They cannot be undertaken and not allowed, and yet we've had both the Queensland and New South Wales government continually turning a blind eye, together with the federal government. And then more recently, with the addition of the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, they had DataQ, which is their own satellite system that can actually show in real time dams not only being built, but also water flows. So there's records that had gone through the system where an environmental water flow was purchased at one station, let's say in the Queensland side of the border. It's gone maybe a kilometre, and that water was pumped out, that environmental water was pumped out by the next irrigator in the catchment. So you may well have got paid you as a taxpayer may well have paid $10 million to get environmental water down the river system. It may be purchased from John Smith, and a mile down the river, or a kilometre down the river, his neighbour pulls that water up and puts it onto his own private dam or his own private crop. And the Murray-Darling Basin Authority have watched this the whole time. Now, clearly that must mean there's a conflict, not only a conflict of interest, but police need to investigate the situation, because it's effectively water theft, and yet it's been watched by the Murray-Darling Basin Authority take place, and they've effectively got the footage but chose not to tell anybody. So, we've got the degree of destruction of the river system is at multi-levels. We've got the situation where you've got a number of people in politics who have a very, very, very strong base in irrigation within their own families, or certainly within their own communities, and at every turn the laws of Australia have been prostituted to benefit the select few further up the catchment, and destroying the integrity of the river system going on. So it's been an attack both further up the catchment but also lower down the catchment. The bad guys wanted the Menindee Lakes after 30 million years to look like they don't hold water, and a lot of the policies that the Murray-Darling Basin Authority answer for is to say, we drain the Menindee Lakes because they're not very efficient. Well, they've been there 30 million years. 121 species of bird life come as far away from as Siberia. the major fishing ground of the golden perch and the cod are born and brought up in the Menindee Lakes. That tends to tell me after 30 million years that lake system's pretty efficient.
But one thing is, by draining it, we all know that the big corporates have bought the water licences and they're selling them to the farmers, water to the farmers for a fortune, especially now in a drought. Now, by draining the Menindee Lakes, that in itself would have pushed the price of water up, wouldn't it?
Oh, without a doubt, massively, and it's destroyed. You know, we at the moment on 60 Minutes on Sunday night, there's going to be a program showing the water's getting pushed through the Barmera choke to get water down to the, well, they're saying environmental water, but it may well be for the almond growers in South Australia. So you've got a double whammy. They've destroyed the integrity of the Menindee Lakes, which was nature's way of providing a flow going down the Murray-Darling. So that's been destroyed. So for the corporates, they're draining the Dartmouth Dam and the Hume Dam on the Murray River system at a massive rate. They're pushing, well, they lost 2 Sydney harbours of water getting through the Barmera choke, of water just flooding out over areas that should not be there. And therefore you're draining whatever water storages we have going forward. So let's say if this drought goes forward for another 2 years, we could have a situation where the whole Murray-Darling Basin system is dry. People say that's an absurdity. The Murray's always been there. Well, during my lifetime, and the only time the Darling River system went dry was for 3 months in 1943-44. People say the Darling River went dry regularly. That's only from the perspective of riverboats. If in actual fact it was riverboats couldn't get through, they said it was dry. So effectively anything under 3 foot of water would mean it's dry. So those up the northern catchment of the Darling River system know the facts. They knew 40% of the water supply of the Murray-Darling Basin comes down the Darling. It's just there's so few people on the Darling River system. Our communities are so small that we were the easy pickings. The Australian population knows the Murray River system. You ask 10 people, what's your river? The Murray. Maybe 1 in 10 might say the Ord River system in, far north. But very few know about the Darling. And yet
Just quickly, the Darling's dry now, isn't it?
We've got 1,500 kilometres of the Darling River dry. So the Darling River is actually the longest river in Australia, from the Condamine, if you include the Condamine, down to Wentworth.
Condamine where?
In Queensland.
Where is it?
From the tributaries of the Darling River system, if you start at the top tributaries, because there's about 7 tributaries that turn into the Darling River system, if you go up to the top of those tributaries and you go to Wentworth, you've got the longest river system.
No, but where exactly is the top there?
I'll shoot you through a bit of a picture. I'll show
like
you
Cairns, is it?
No.
Oh.
About a third of the way up through Queensland. But it's 15, so
Kai,
it's
roughly.
1,500 kilometres up.
15 kilometres, yep.
1,500 kilometres up. So you've got, the Darling River system is the longest river system in Australia.
Now, just quickly, if the Menindee Lakes weren't dry, they're dry at the moment too?
Yep, they're dry.
If they weren't dry, they would be feeding into the Darling, wouldn't they?
Yep, they certainly would. They should have at least 6 or 7 years more supply of water. If they'd been maintained like they have been for the last 200 years since white settlement has been here, certainly, and certainly, let's say from the 50s, when the 1950s, when the changes that South Australia put forward through, we would have at least 6 to 7 years supply of water left in the Menindee Lakes. And that's why even those fish kills, Australians saw me holding a fish with Dick Arnold in January this year, where there was one of the 3 million fish kills that took place. Those fish would have been able to be flushed down the river because you had 7 years supply of water. The problem is they had nowhere to go because the Murray-Darling Basin Authority had deliberately undermined the integrity of the river system and drained out the Menindee Lakes. So for Australians to see 3 million dead fish is an absolute catastrophe, but in real terms you may well have killed between 20 to 60 million fish may well have died in the Menindee Lakes and the Darling River system. and it's all man-made, nothing to do with drought. Unfortunately, you've got a number of politicians blaming everything on drought. That is not the case.
That's the big lie they're using to cover up.
That is a total lie to cover up the over-extraction and the misallocation. Even the South Australian Royal Commission said maladministration bordering on criminal activity undertaken by the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. Now, the Murray-Darling Basin Authority has been in place for 5 years. They refused to turn up to the South Australian Royal Commission. By law, they have to turn up. At the time, also the Prime Minister made Commonwealth employees refuse them to turn up to give evidence at the South Australian Royal Commission. And it went to the High Court, and the High Court said in their preliminary findings, if we have a federation of states, then as a federation of states, all must attend. But unfortunately, in that meantime, the South Australian government changed from Labor to Liberal, and clearly a phone call came from Canberra to the new South Australian Premier's Department, and South Australia shut down the South Australian Royal Commission. So Brett Walker had done an amazing job, and Australians read the South Australian Royal Commission.
Brett Walker was he the commissioner or?
Brett Walker was the commissioner, and his associate was Richard Beasley.
Yep.
It's a great report. It really does say, well, in my little humble view, you've got the worst criminal activity in Australian history taking place, destroying the integrity of the river for short-term profits.
And that was basically covered up when the South Australian government went from Labor to Liberal. The Liberal government covered it up.
What they did was say they couldn't afford to run the Royal Commission. Now, the Royal Commission had gone for, I think it was 100 days, and cost a total of $5 million. Now, the Australian population has already handed out about $8 billion for water to come down the river system. Where's the $8 billion?
Well, I can tell you 80 million's with Angus Taylor, and I think 12 million of that's over in the Cayman Islands.
And how much is in Webster's account for not only Tandale Cotton, there was some very interesting dealings.
Webster's a company, that's a huge company, isn't it?
Yes, but there was dealings between water ministers and businesses. It's now owned by a Canadian consortium, but there's a number of these dams on the Hay Plains that have been set up, two of which is on Webster's land, that the Australian taxpayers may well have paid $13 million of taxpayers' money to get water out of a river system, to put it on a flat bit of ground, and digging two man-made dams, and it's supposedly water efficiency. How the hell can the taxpayers of Australia potentially pay, well, on the Hay Plains they're talking maybe $100 to $200 million that have gone into the pockets of private individuals, because these dams that have been set up on the Hay Plains are on private land.
So why did the government why did the government pay them to set up the dams?
We need a Royal Commission into this.
Oh, you don't. So that's unknown then.
There's no commonsensical way in the world why public monies would drag water out of a natural river system across country in pipes to put it in a man-made dam on a private block of land to go into traditionally unirrigated country to put potentially either cotton or almonds in. That the Hay Plains ran hay. It was dry land farming. But these river systems have developed in recent years on the Murrumbidgee and are going to strangle the Murray totally. The way in which it works is each valley, supposedly, under these laws, each valley has the ability, if you can't use the water in your little valley, now your little valley might be 10 kilometres long, the laws in Australia have been prostituted that much that if you can't use the water in this year in your valley, then you're allowed to take out up to 2 or 3 years extra water. Now, we're in a drought. These people are taking water out of a river system in a drought because their little valley isn't taking all the water. Now, it's not taking into consideration anybody else on the 3,500 other kilometres of the Murray-Darling Murrumbidgee river system, because each valley is treated separately. So you've got laws that have no integrity, deliberately set up to undermine the river systems for short-term gains by a select few.
What about the cotton farms? The cotton farms are saying in Queensland, southern Queensland and northern New South Wales, they're saying they're not doing any damage to the water flow.
Since 1974, the cotton industry has exploded by 4,000% increase in irrigated cotton in Australia on the Murray and the Murrumbidgee in recent times, but also very much on the Darling River system. Even last year, when Australia was in drought, over 100,000 irrigated hectares of water was taken out of the river systems, and private dams that have been set up. 100,000 hectares of irrigated cotton went in last year during the worst drought in Australian history. It is that commonsensical. And even in this year, we've got a situation on the Dubbo where aquifers are being attacked with huge pipes drawing vast amounts of water out of the aquifer to flood irrigate cotton.
So just for the average person who might know what an aquifer is, it's just it's a dam under the ground, basically.
It's basically 20 million years worth of water that has taken to amass underneath the about 15% of Australia, and effectively we don't know how that can be recharged and how long it will take to be recharged. But you've got people pulling millions and millions and millions of litres out to put on a potentially unsustainable crop in the middle of the worst drought in Australian history, destroying the aquifer for all others, because other farmers have, take out like a 1-inch or 2-inch pipe to feed their stock and keep the stock alive, and they've done that for the last 300 years or 250 years. But this is massive. These pipes are huge, and they're just absolutely. It just shows a total disrespect for the country. This will affect the water table and also the ability to recharge the trees. When the rivers get going, the water might well disappear down into the cracks to try and recharge these aquifers. So, there's a chain of events that it just shows you that there are people out there with potentially unsustainable crops that have absolutely no respect for the country they're in.
So the bottom line is they're making a fortune out of selling cotton. They're taking the water that could be better utilised by other farmers. And
absolutely. Well, they're taking the livelihood of the whole food supply. So the Murray-Darling Basin feeds about 40 million people. At the moment, the dairy industry is in total collapse. Suicide rates have doubled in New South Wales. Work cover is exploding in the other states. Not so much that people are getting hurt working at longer hours, but they're staging their own deaths so that their wives can claim on the insurance. Never before in the history of the planet are farmers, sustainable irrigators and farmers seen as public enemy number one. We are a threatened species. We are being treated like the worst people by this federal government. And you've got the federal government saying, we've got $7 billion to spend on farmers. No, you don't. You've just earmarked $5 of the $7 billion to set up big dams further up the catchments to supply the unsustainable crops.
So mate, the money they're allocating to dams is actually for the cotton farmers.
It's not for the river system. We've got the Menindee Lakes, 4 times the size of Sydney Harbour, and it's the breeding ground. It's the greatest wetland south of Kakadu in the world, in Australia. And look at the figures, the numbers. The fact that 121 species of 250,000 birds come down from all around the world, that it is the major breeding ground of all the fish species in Australia. This is not he said, she said. This is the reality, and all this is being destroyed and the science has been destroyed. I mean, I remember turning up to the Royal Commission in South Australia, and one of the scientists from CSIRO said, you know, he had people from the Murray-Darling Basin Authority effectively saying, do you want your job? And he said, what do you mean? He said, unless you change your numbers, then you will lose your job. So you had standover tactics like the brown shirts in 33, and these people have destroyed the science of the Murray-Darling Basin. The reason why the Murray-Darling Basin is collapsing is because science has been destroyed because of vested interests and the power and bully boy tactics of organisations allegedly such as the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, because that representative from CSIRO at the Royal Commission effectively said he was bullied into providing numbers that were what the Murray-Darling Basin Authority wanted.
Well, I don't know if you've ever seen that. There was a video of Barnaby Joyce that was released a few months ago, and it was from him, I think from about 2017, where he bragged about sacking the head of his department because the head of his department wouldn't do what he was told.
You've got a situation in Australia today where science has been absolutely destroyed. The 2,750 gigs, which was supposedly going to be the number, there's supposed to be about 6,000 gigs of water returned to the Murray-Darling Basin system to get a river system up and running. 2,750 was the area code of a politician in Sydney. That's how the scientists had given up on trying to get integrity. They said, look, we're getting pushed and bullied around, bugger it. We'll just use 2,750 because one of the politicians, it's his area code for his electorate. And that's the type of, never before in the Western world have we seen science been so totally attacked, under siege by federal and state governments, and also by, allegedly by the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, that science has been destroyed, undermined, and in return the river systems have paid the price. Every activity that these governments are doing are not set up to make the rivers succeed.
Well, when you say the science has been destroyed, you mean they're destroying the science to try and justify what they're doing?
They've changed the numbers. They've changed the numbers. You know, you look at the whole Murray-Darling water sharing plan, all the different changes that they've made deliberately don't take into consideration any of the actual flows. They include major flows. A couple of things on the Darling River system. In the 1952 period, in 1976, were vast amounts of water that came down the river system. So that pushes the averages up. Now, effectively, if you took out those two major events, then the irrigators wouldn't be able to take out half as much water as they can. And so effectively the numbers have been modified.
So what they've done, they basically pushed the averages up. That means cotton farmers can take out more water because they say on average is like 100 million litres.
Yep.
When it's only really 50 million litres.
Yep.
So
they've been taking out 86% of the flows have gone to a select few. I mean, that's the numbers we're talking about. 86% of the water has gone to a small number of irrigators in the northern basin, which left nothing for the environment, left nothing for the rivers.
The irony of that, well, not the irony, but you're basically saying they've fudged the figures to justify what they're doing. It's interesting that Angus Taylor in the last couple of days has been accused of fudging figures to have a swipe at the Sydney Lord Mayor. He fudged figures in a report, and the Labor Party are now going to refer that to the police. So exactly what you've said. One of the key players in the fraud happening with the Murray-Darling Basin has done just that openly.
We've got all these are alleged.
Yeah, alleged.
We need a Royal Commission because we have no faith in the New South Wales and federal government. Intimidation. I was in front of the Royal Commissioner, so I can say this. I had Niall Blair, New South Wales Water Minister at the time, when I went to MIMCO about a year or so ago. I walked up to him, going, "Niall, how are you going?" "Good, thanks, Rob. Yourself?" "Good." He told me he was monitoring me on a daily basis, and everything that I do was being recorded and monitored, and if I put a foot wrong, I would be fixed.
What's his position now?
He's jumped to the upper house, and he's got 8 years of sitting in a dark room. So he's taken a backward step.
What do you mean sitting in a dark? He's a senator now, New South Wales senator, is he?
No, he's the upper house. No, he's the upper house state government. So upper house state government. I don't know what he does, but conceivably we haven't heard hide nor hear of him since. But we do need to, he obviously, a lot of the policies that were taken place continue to take place under his time as Water Minister. So we really do need ICAC to come up with what they found out since 2007, but more importantly from 2012 to 2019, that's when a vast amount of damage has been caused. That's when, be it cotton or almonds, we are exporting water off the most fragile river system in the inhabited countries.
What do you mean exporting water?
Well, in the form of cotton or almonds. It takes about 4.5 litres of water per almond.
Yep.
So all you're doing, effectively, is killing your river systems to export water in the form of cotton and the form of almonds. So can we afford to kill our river systems? Well, not only killing our river systems, our communities, Barkinji, the First Nations people, but also all the sustainable irrigators and farmers who feed and clothe the nation, they are collapsing. This year we are going to be a net importer of dairy in Australia. Our dairy industry is in total collapse.
So we're going to be importing milk?
Importing milk and cream from New Zealand. We will be and literally herds. One dairy, I believe it's somewhere in the vicinity of 600 to 800 dairies have gone under in the last 12 months. It's one a week now that is leaving the industry.
How many? 600 to 800?
600.
Oh, I've gone.
In the last year, there's now at the moment one per week. So they are killing their breeding stock of the last 200 years. They're going up to the meatworks. They're not coming back.
And that's because the water, they can't afford the water.
They can't afford the water. Water bills went from $30,000 a year to $300,000 a year, $400,000 a year. So what was traditional? So your milk supply, which we have taken for granted of, you will be buying imported Chinese milk with probably melamine in it to build up the protein numbers. Like I had when I was in China, they were putting melamine in the sweets. Unfortunately, it killed a few people, but it did in fact push up the protein content, and therefore they were paid more money.
So you think we'll be importing Chinese milk soon?
Within 5 years, we will be importing Chinese milk. We are losing the ability to feed ourselves. Our food security has never been more under siege and totally neglected by a Liberal National Party. Weren't the National Party from the bush? Clearly they're not. They only appear now to want to service and dance as puppets for the corporates and the foreign multinationals. That are the farmers and sustainable irrigators of Australia are under siege like nowhere else on the planet. You need farmers 3 times a day. You might need a doctor once a year, you might need a politician once a lifetime, but you certainly need a farmer 3 times a day. And our food supply is collapsing. Now, we've got to put this in context with the African flu that's running through pigs at the moment. 75% of pigs in China are dead, 25% on the planet. I was speaking to a person in the wool industry who was up there last week. Pig prices have gone up 300%, pork prices.
Yep.
So we'll be exporting all our food over to China. So we'll have the scraps off the plates of China within 5 years unless Australians wake up to the urgency to take this government to action, to do something for farmers. You had the National Farmers Federation, who appeared to be strongly linked to irrigators,
Yep.
suggesting that it may well be time for farmers to leave our industry. That is the most stupid thing I've ever heard, and if the people involved in that Farmers Federation would like to stop eating, then that would be a great idea. Stupid idea, because we do need farmers more than ever before. The world's food supply is very precariously placed. We have the most efficient and best quality food producers in the world. And to suggest for a minute for the National Farmers Federation or the federal government to supply exiting farmers, that would mean that foreign multinationals would take over a greater share of our food supply and security as it is. China has increased its land holding in Australia tenfold in the last 2 years. China can now put, from their land, they can put their produce on their trucks to their port, on their boat, to their country, without paying a cent of tax.
Yep.
When is Australians going to wake up that food security is a major issue? As you see the Murray-Darling Basin system collapse, so you see the last bastion of Australian ownership. What is owned by Australia today other than the land and the farmers? Everything else appears to be sold out under the guise of efficiencies of capitalist system. I see that vast amounts of our infrastructure is now owned by multinationals who can turn off everything. And
So
now,
basically you're saying, and I think most people would agree, that the politicians, both federally and state, are jumping to the tune of the multinational companies.
They are totally complicit to the desires and needs of multinationals.
I'll try and... Yep, sorry.
Maybe we should start a process of not feeding our Prime Minister.
Yeah.
Just stop feeding him until such time as he has a hungry stomach for 4 days, and then he can say, as he is doing now, that $7 billion, of which $5 billion isn't even going to eventuate in dams for another 10 years,
Yep.
Tell him to live for the short term. We are facing the worst environmental disaster in our country's history,
Yep.
orchestrated by total mismanagement of the river system,
Yep.
greed and corruption of the river system
Yep.
for a select few corporates, and never before have we more needed a Royal Commission, as there is no federal ICAC in Canberra, and the Prime Minister recently rejected any plans to allow a vote on that. We are facing potentially the most corrupt government we have ever had in our country.
Yep.
At the most inopportune time, because we are now facing food security issues, water security issues like we have never seen before by government action. So please, ladies and gentlemen, this is not about drought. This is about decimating farmers, decimating the river system, and doing so for short-term profits at the expense of your food security and your children's positions in society, in a democracy, in Australia's future.
Theft, distortion. There has been some absolutely horrendous deals done behind closed doors. That I don't care whether you distinguish them as being corrupt or naive, but the same effect, where there was a massive amount of funds paid for zero amount of water, and they just need to be taken to task, and a lot of those deals need to be reviewed and analysed, and only a Royal Commission has the power to actually get that information to determine.
One point in case is, as a new MP, I had to do my pecuniary interest, and there's no obligation at all to disclose my water portfolio at all. I've got to talk about my shares, my land, who employed me, where I get my money from, but there's no obligation. There's an optional disclosure form down the bottom of where I could put a little box there where I could put my water, which I did do, but I spoke to quite a number of people, and I was wondering whether that was right or not. Water, we should have to actually disclose our water, because there's people making decisions in this place that must own water. It's easier, you could go and buy water, it's easier than opening up a bank account, and you could be trading it. So there's people out there that want to make water scarce so that they can temporarily trade it. Now, so I'm actually calling, I'll put a bill through about a water register so that we can actually find out individuals and corporates who owns water, because a lot of those people that do own water must be making the decision about making water scarce for irrigated agriculture. Now, if it's scarce, during right now, temporary water is trading at what, $800 a meg?
Yeah.
Right? When the times are good, that water, I know I bought water in for $25 a meg. So we know that there's city people trading water and loving this plan, because while it's scarce, farmers are under pressure, they've got to feed their cows, they've got to buy in water, they're making a fortune out of people's misery.
It's nothing for the corporates to step into a market. You can't blame them. Politicians have created the environment for externals to come in and buy water. You used to have to be a landowner to buy water. Now, for a corporate to come in and spend $40–50 million, taking a large position on water, keeping it off the market, drive the price up 286%, I think Duxton recorded last year, before they divest that position. Now, they're doing their job. They're making money and trading in commodity. But if you actually close that loophole, they divest that position, water comes back onto the market, they go and trade copper or something different. And just two examples I wanted to give you about the bad management. In the Millennium Drought that Helen was talking about, 25, 26, 27, there was not one drop of water spilled through the Barmah Forest. Now, last year, I think there's about 800, and every year since there's been 400,000 megalitres of water spilled in dry times, trying to push this insane volume down to South Australia. And just to put things in perspective, with the volumes going to South Australia, we have no objection to us South Australians using the water for irrigation either. That is 500,000 megalitres per year that South Australia need for all of their irrigators. There is 5 million megs per year, on average, over the last 10 years, going to South Australia. So most of it's running out to sea, lost in transmission or evaporated.
Today we've seen reports once again of mass fish kills occurring within far west New South Wales. Now, 9 months ago, when the first fish kills occurred, they were actually occurring within the Darling River. Today these fish kills are occurring within the Menindee Lakes themselves. Once again, the Federal Water Minister, David Littleproud, has come out saying this is caused by drought and that it's normal in these situations. How many scientific reports do we need stating that this is because of over-extraction and mismanagement of our water for him to wake up? What's occurring is not normal. We've lived through droughts in the past. These fish, the big Murray cod, which are 70 or 80 years old, have lived through drought numerous times. This is caused purely by over-extraction and mismanagement of our water. Now, the New South Wales government is pushing on with plans to actually decommission these lakes. Now, these are a critical fish breeding area. They are known as the womb of the entire Murray-Darling Basin for these fish. We're seeing the benefits of them even now. 9 months ago, the first fish were dying within the river system, and even though these lakes are only sitting below 1% capacity, these fish that have died today have actually lived another 9 months. Now, what is going on is not normal. We need to protect these lakes, and we need to protect the fish that rely on them as well. The sad fact is that there is nothing we can do right now. There simply isn't the water in the basin to get it down to the Menindee Lakes and save any of these fish. But what we need to do is really push our politicians to start fighting for a royal commission. We need to get to the bottom of why millions upon millions of fish have continued to die within the basin, even after the Murray-Darling Basin Plan has been put in place. The idea of it was to protect the communities and environment and put those things above and before irrigation, and that simply isn't happening. So please get onto your politicians, let's get to the bottom of what's going on and move forward.